Shalom. Today we are going to be talking about some laws and feasts. The laws covered in this Torah portion are about finance and property, while the feasts being covered are the Feasts of Unleavened Bread, the Feasts of Weeks, and the Feast of Tabernacles. If I could give this portion a nickname, it would be that God is establishing a just and prosperous society. God is establishing a just and prosperous society. In a world where justice is rather rare and prosperity seems foreign to most, God, in an interesting way, makes an interesting twist to things. It is a twist because we have been conditioned to function a certain way when it comes to these things such as money and prosperity. However, God always has a different way of doing things because His ways are not our ways. Therefore, it is fascinating to see one of the ways that we are able to achieve the status of a just and prosperous society. So let's talk about finance first. The world has a way of governing their finances, and it is often centered around greed. Who can make the most money? Who can make their way to the top the fastest? Who lives in the biggest house? These are a lot of what society looks to when it is measuring a man's prosperity. However, to God, money isn't everything. In God's economy, money is included in the trade, but it is not the only thing that has value. In fact, in our Torah portion, in Deuteronomy, it talks about tithing. But it is not about money. Rather, it is about resources and food that has the significance when it comes to this type of tithing. It was commanded that they would take 1/10 of everything they owned. Again, this is regarding food and drink. And they would eat the 1/10 of their resources in the presence of the Lord, where He was going to choose. If they had too much to carry with them to the place where the Lord chose because of living a far distance, then it was permissible for them to trade their 1/10 for silver, and then buy the supplies needed when they actually got to the place where the Lord chose. At the end of every 3rd year, they were to bring their 1/10 of that year and store it up for the needy as well as the Levites, because the Levites had no land or inheritance of their own. If they were to do this, the Lord promised they would be blessed. And so as we read in the Torah portion of Deuteronomy 14:22, it says, "Every year be sure to save 1/10 of the crops harvested from whatever you plant in your fields. Eat the 1/10 of your grain, new wine, and olive oil, and eat the firstborn of your cattle, sheep, and goats in the presence of Yahweh, your Elohim, in the place He will choose to put His name. Then you will learn to fear Yahweh, your Elohim, as long as you live." Now, there is a very interesting concept in regards to debt that is owed. This is called the year of release. And it was to happen every 7 years, where any debt that people owed would be canceled. They were allowed to ask a foreigner to pay the debt owed, but not someone who was of Israel. It didn't matter how much or how little there was. It was to be forgiven. If someone came to you and needed something near the 7th year, a person was to be very careful that they wouldn't think ill towards that person since the 7th year was approaching. They were to not refrain from giving to that person in need just because the year of release was coming, or else that person in need could pray to the Lord, and the Lord would be against that person who refused to give. They needed to give to the poor with open arms, because it's not God's desire that anyone be poor among the brethren, because God promised to bless them in the land he promised to give them. Another law that was put in place was concerning property. More specifically, slaves and the firstborn animals. Now, the concept of slaves in the Tanakh are not the same as we would think about slavery today. The slaves in ancient days within Israel were not treated the same way the Jews were treated in Egypt. They were treated far better and had a limited contract of 6 years. On the 7th year, they were allowed to go free with provision from the household they were leaving. They were not to be left empty-handed, and this was for them to remember that the Lord freed Israel out of Egypt. However, some of the slaves saw the household they served as if it were like their own family, and they loved them as such. Therefore, if they choose to, there would be a ritual done wherein all would be pierced into the earlobe, onto the door, and they would be the family's slave forever. This was the same standard for both men and women slaves. And so, as it says in the portion, Deuteronomy 15:18, if you have to let your slave go free, it won't be a hardship for you. It would have cost you twice as much to hire someone to do the same work for those 6 years. Besides, Yahweh, your Elohim, will bless you in everything you do. In regards to firstborn male animals, they were all to be set apart for God every year without defect or blemish, and they were not allowed to be put to work. They were to be sacrificed to the Lord at the place God would choose, and then eaten by the whole family. If there were any that had blemishes on them of any kind, then it was not to be sacrificed to God. But it could still be eaten in the city they were from. They would still need to make sure the blood of the animal was properly disposed of, never to consume it. As we know in the Torah, it is forbidden for anyone to consume blood, because the life of the animal is in the blood. Now, let's move on to when the feasts are reviewed. The people of Israel was reminded of the 3 major feasts that they were to uphold: the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Feast of Weeks, and the Feasts of Tabernacles. For Passover, there was to be no sacrifice done in any of the cities they would live in, only the place where God would choose. For the Feasts of Weeks, they were to start harvesting grain and count 7 weeks. They were to bring a free will offering of how much God had blessed them with, and enjoy themselves with their communities. Finally, the Feast of Tabernacles was also meant to be enjoyed. They were to live in these booths to be reminded of how they lived in the wilderness, where God took them from and where he brought them to. These 3 festivals were to be observed every year during their appointed time at the place where God would choose, and no one would come empty-handed. There had to be an offering given to the Lord. There had to be something brought to the table, because God brought everything to the table for his people when he delivered them. So it is not too much of God to ask for a simple offering, not necessarily because God cared about the blood of goats and sheep and birds and whatnot. The point of it was relationship. He wanted to establish relationship with his people. And in that day, this was the way that they were able to do it in a safe manner, because sin kept them from being able to approach God. And so, in a way, you could look at this as God saying, I'm going to take what I can get. If you at least being able to come close to my throne, even though you cannot yet approach it because of sin, I will take what I can get, because the point is that I desire you in my presence. Now, how does all of this point to Jesus, you might ask? How does this point to Yeshua, our Messiah? I'm glad you did ask. Jesus is coming back very soon. He's coming back as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. He is going to usher in a time of justice and prosperity that has not been seen since the creation of the world. It will be unlike any time in history, because no one will ever lack again. There will be no more hunger. The ultimate debt of our sin has been paid. Therefore, we will have had the opportunity to enter into an eternal celebration. There will be perfect harmony in the animal kingdom, with no need to sacrifice any animals. No animals will be killed, and yet the ecosystem will be perfectly balanced. There will be no need for slaves anymore, because everyone will have a job to do, and we will work in sync with one another. The Lord is our Passover. We will have perfect fellowship with the Holy Spirit, and the Feast of Tabernacles will be fulfilled through the millennial reign of Jesus Christ. All of mankind, redeemed mankind, will eternally enjoy the fruits of perfect fellowship with God and one another in the world to come.